Why is food so expensive in New Zealand? I've met many people who travelled New Zealand and said they loved our scenery, but they couldn't really enjoy their trip because of the high cost of food. They said food was so expensive that it chewed through their budget much faster than they were expecting. This meant they had less money to spend on tourist activities. Consequently, most said that they would never come back to New Zealand for a holiday. Tourists also notice our supermarket shelves are often empty as items are out of stock. New Zealand feeds more than 40 million global consumers each year according to New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. There are only 5.3 million people living here, so we're not the ones eating all of that food. So if we can feed more than 40 million people, why is food so expensive here? To start with, let's discuss GST on food. GST is Goods and Services Tax, which is more commonly known as Value Added Tax in Europe and simply Sales Tax in the US. New Zealand's GST on food is fairly steep. We'll compare New Zealand's GST on food with other OECD nations. So starting with Australia, they have 0% GST on basic food items. Basic food items are essential food items such as milk, bread, cheese, butter. Prepared meals are taxed at 10%. Canada is very similar to Australia. They've opted for 0% GST on basic groceries. France, 5.5% on food items. Germany, 7%. The Irish have adopted the same system that Australia is using, where it's 0% on most food items, but if it's processed or prepared food, it's taxed at 13.5%. Israel is 0%, Italy 4%, Japan 8%, Korea 0% on basic food items, Mexico 0%, the Netherlands 9%. So here we are, New Zealand 15% uniform GST on all goods including food. So we pay 15% GST on milk, butter, bread, cheese. We are similar to Norway, 15%, but it says here in the notes that specific food items might be 12%. United Kingdom, 0% on most food items. Snacks and prepared foods are taxed at 20%, so like Australia, if it's prepared, then you have to pay the GST on it. The US, sales tax varies, so 0% to 10% in most states, which is quite reasonable. Switzerland, 2.5% VAT on food items. Spain, 4% on basic food items. The highest is Denmark at 25% uniform VAT on all goods including food. So 25% is incredibly high. New Zealand is higher than average at 15% for basic food items. New Zealand has a high child poverty rate and many children don't have enough food to eat or even a bed to sleep in, so it's quite alarming that GST on essential food items like milk and bread is so high. New Zealand families right across the country are struggling to buy fresh vegetables and fruit to feed their growing children. So why would New Zealand add 15% GST on top of vegetables, fruit, milk and bread? If you'd like to understand more about the pros and cons of setting such a high rate of GST on food, I can make a separate video to explain why New Zealand has opted for such high GST. That's a whole video in itself, so I'll make that next time. But moving on, let's talk about exports. New Zealand exported a record 52 billion in food and fibre exports in 2022. 95% of our dairy products are exported. Milk powder, butter and cheese were New Zealand's largest export commodity group, making up 28% of total exports according to Stats New Zealand. We also export meat, wine, fruit and vegetables and so on. An export-oriented economy can lead to higher prices domestically as producers can command better prices in international markets. Additionally, New Zealand vegetable growers cannot afford to pay the same for wages and land that growers of high-value export fruit can, such as kiwi fruit. In this article on Stuff, Richard Burke said vegetable growers had little opportunity to expand their operations by buying land to grow more produce on, because growers of export crops such as apples and kiwi fruit were making larger profits and could pay for more land. Vegetable growers could not compete with export growers. Coupled with high prices for transport, fertilizer, fuel and high inflation, there were now huge risks involved in growing vegetables, he said. Vegetable growers had to pay more for land and labour and had to ask more for their products to remain profitable. High food prices and high prices for resources were becoming a trend, he said. Growers were constantly playing a balancing act between profit and loss. If too much of a crop is available, then the prices growers receive would be low and they make a loss. He uses broccoli as an example. Growers were profitable when there was stable pricing and enough fresh produce to sell, he said. Food security in New Zealand depended on vegetable growers remaining competitive and having access to labour, land and water. So this brings us on to the topic of labour costs. New Zealand has relatively high labour costs and a high minimum wage. New Zealand's minimum wage is currently $23.15 an hour. New Zealand's cost of living is extremely high and we're consistently ranked amongst the most unaffordable places to live when wages are compared to housing costs. Many people in New Zealand struggle to afford their rent and food. Auckland consistently ranks in the top 10 most unaffordable cities in the world. The New Zealand government increases the minimum wage to ease the burden, which is why we have such a high minimum wage. But this puts pressure on vegetable growers. The agricultural sector is labour-intensive as growers have to hire tractor drivers, fruit pickers, harvesters, packers, forklift drivers, and so on. And these high wages contribute to the overall cost of food production. This means the cost of food becomes more expensive in New Zealand. It's not just kiwi fruit orchards tying up land that could be used to grow vegetables. In the Marlborough region, vineyards dominate the area. The region has almost 28,000 hectares, which is almost 69,000 acres, of vineyards for wine production. In 2006, wine critics claimed Cloudy Bay produces one of the world's best Sauvignon Blanc wines. Since then, demand for Marlborough wine boomed and farmers ditched vegetable growing in favour of planting vineyards. Land that was formerly used to grow food now grows grapes for wine. I noticed that the frozen green beans that I bought were grown in Belgium. It's crazy to think that New Zealand imports green beans when we're a farming nation, but if the profits are higher for apples, kiwi fruit and wine, then that's what farmers will produce. Compliance costs. New Zealand has strict food safety and quality standards, which increases production costs and adds to the price of food. Additionally, compliance with environmental regulations increases costs for farmers, and these costs are then passed on to consumers. I've met many people in New Zealand who own land and they tried to set up agricultural businesses such as a free-range egg farm, but they found compliance costs were unreasonably high and they ended up abandoning their business. It's no surprise that our supermarket shelves are always bare in the egg section. Additionally, the ban on battery cages for layer hens took effect in 2023, and this resulted in a shortage of eggs and higher costs. Furthermore, the cost of grain and animal feed has increased, which means it costs more to feed the hens, and these costs are passed on to consumers. So we've discussed how the New Zealand government imposes strict compliance regulations, but to add insult to injury, subsidies and support for farmers are scarce in New Zealand. This means the worst of both worlds for New Zealand's farmers. Many countries offer their agricultural sector a government subsidy and provide some support. However, the New Zealand government does little in terms of offering subsidies and support, which means these higher costs are reflected in consumer prices. Natural disasters. Natural disasters are a major problem in New Zealand. We have earthquakes, floods, landslides. Cyclone Gabriel recently destroyed many farms. The cyclone damaged apple orchards, vineyards, kiwi fruit and avocados, and affected about a third of New Zealand's sheep and half its beef cattle. So our natural disasters are another reason why food can be expensive and why we often have food shortages. Geographic isolation. We're miles away from anywhere and we always get left off world maps because of it. New Zealand is geographically isolated, and unsurprisingly that increased the cost of importing goods. Auckland and Sydney are over 2,000 kilometres apart, and that adds to the cost of importing anything from Australia, such as the Australian brown rice that I buy. Shipping and transport costs to and from other major global markets are high. Transportation costs are also high within New Zealand. The cost of transporting goods to rural areas, remote areas, and less accessible areas is high. Aside from being so isolated, we have a relatively small population, which is largely due to our unaffordable cost of living combined with our lack of job opportunities. Young Kiwis tend to leave New Zealand after graduating university in search of professional, well-paid jobs overseas, and young people also seek cheaper rent and food. This results in a brain drain as young Kiwis leave in search of a better life. Having a small population means New Zealand lacks the economies of scale that larger markets like the US and Germany benefit from. Our small population means we have limited competition, which can lead to higher prices. Our two main supermarket chains are Woolworths and Foodstuffs, which has led to a supermarket duopoly. Having only two dominant players leads to less competitive pricing, and so the supermarkets add significant markups, which increases the retail price of food. Both Woolworths and Foodstuffs frequently use misleading specials, which is believed to be a tactic designed to confuse consumers into paying even more for food. Newspapers in New Zealand report the duopoly makes excessive profits. However, Foodstuffs denies this claim. Both Woolworths and Foodstuffs have pointed out that New Zealand's high retail crime rate results in lost profits, and then honest, hard-working households end up making up the difference by paying higher prices for their groceries. And it's not just the supermarkets that are battling high crime rates in New Zealand, it's also the farmers. This year, hundreds of kilograms of blueberries were stolen from a Hawke's Bay farm. The farm's entire crop of blueberries was stolen. In New Zealand, 1 in 4 farms had stock stolen, and equipment theft of items such as quad bikes is common now. When crops, stock and equipment are stolen, these costs are passed on to New Zealand consumers. There are also many other factors at play, such as fluctuations in the exchange rate and global market influences on our food costs. But if I listed every reason why New Zealand's food costs are so high, it would be a very long video. If you can think of any other reasons you'd like to add, please add these in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.